Hi there, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. And this is a very special edition because we have a ceasefire. And hopefully, the sides will stick to it, the bloodshed will end, the hostages will return, and who knows, maybe eventually some sort of diplomatic resolution can be arrived at. A boy can dream. This is the first truly great news I've been able to deliver. Well, I guess since the last hostage deal, but this one's even better because it ends the war, gets more hostages out since I started this godforsaken YouTube channel. So, this is the most fun I've had doing one of these. I am delighted. Now, before we start talking about the specifics of the deal, let's talk a little bit about why this is so important. I feel like people from other countries don't necessarily understand why the hostages are so important to Israelis. And you have to understand a little bit about the psychology behind the creation of the state. The idea that in a world that's hostile to the Jewish people, Jews will be there for each other, will guarantee each other's safety, will stand behind each other, will stand united as a society. Something that's taken a tremendous amount of blows in the last few years as Israeli civil society drifts apart, as schisms erupt, as polarization tears Israel apart the way it's torn apart a lot of other countries. And the hostages are a symbol of everything that Israel wants to be, everything that Israel thinks of itself in a positive way, and the way that this government, in the perception of a lot of people, especially on the left, but also in the center, has not done everything that it can to bring them home, has shattered a lot of the sense of what Israelis call arvut hadadit, which means people guaranteeing each other, people being there for each other. And then there's also the question of the what many view as the abandonment of people after October 7th, when the government, the army failed to protect these people and then failed to bring them back. So them coming back heals a wound in the country, and it's hard to describe just how important that is to Israelis. Of course, we don't yet know if all the hostages will return. We're talking about a deal between a unstable Israeli government and a horrific terror organization, which means that we don't know if it'll be fulfilled. But there's a good chance that it'll be fulfilled. And even if it's not fully pursued to the end, some hostages back is better than um, no hostages back. Now, let's talk a little bit about the specifics. We have a lot of specifics. I already talked about the details in the last video, so check that out. The everything I said there was correct. The reports in the media were correct. We do know a little bit more now than we did then. So first of all, the cabinet will meet tomorrow morning at 11 Israel time to approve this. Netanyahu has the numbers to approve it. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will be against it, and we'll talk about that. But he does have the numbers to pass it between the Likud and the Haredi parties that all support it. Now, so far, all that's been worked out is the first phase. And one of the real weaknesses of this deal, I'd say the number one weakness, is the link between phase one and phase two. The deal itself, if you read it, guarantees that there will be a phase two. But that depends on negotiations that start on day 16 in phase one. And there's a lot of people in the government that don't want there to be a phase two. And Netanyahu seems to have promised Bezalel Smotrich that there will be no phase two. Meanwhile, the mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, promised Hamas that there will be a phase two and that they guarantee that it will happen. So once we get to the end of stage one, or towards the end of stage one, there's going to be a lot of pressure about this. So we may find that just like there was all this drama and mess leading up to this deal, there's going to be a drama and mess leading up to phase two. So there's going to be a lot to watch. In that first phase, there's going to be 33 hostages released. We know that not all of them are alive, but Israeli intelligence believes that the majority of them are alive. The numbers I've seen thrown around for how many are alive are 22, 23, and 25. I don't know which, if any, of those is true. Based on the fact that the sources that are throwing these around have been more or less accurate, it's probably in that zip code. So unfortunately, that means we're looking at, between 8 or 10 deceased among them. We also know more or less who's going to be released. It's going to be 4 civilian women, 3 members of the Bibas family, including the 2 children, 5 female soldiers, the 5 observers, 10 men above the age of 50, and 11 men under the age of 50 who are ill or injured. In return, Israel is going to release over 1,000 prisoners. They'll consist of all the women and men up to age 19 who were arrested after October 8th. Those will be released in exchange for the dead bodies, which we still don't know what the exact number of them are. But in exchange for the live hostages, some of the heaviest prisoners will be released, including 250 prisoners with life sentences who will be released, and 400 prisoners who are serving up to 20 years in prison. So that means there's going to be some very serious murderers released. Israel vetoed some murderers they don't want released, probably including the 2 Barghoutis, but we'll find out more details about that later. Among the prisoners are going to be Avera Mengistu and Hisham al-Sayyad, who were captured by Hamas in 2014 and 2015, so a long time ago. They both have mental instability, went into Gaza of their own volition, and have not been returned. We don't know if they're alive or not. We do know that Avera had proof of life at one point, so there's a fairly high chance that he's alive, but absolutely no guarantees. Hamas have so far been unwilling to provide Israel with a list or information on who is alive or dead, which of course results in torturing the families until the last minute. One last bit of psychological pressure. Um, Hamas is supposed to give that list at some point during phase one, and hopefully they will, at least relieving some of the unknowns for the families of the hostages. But even if the list is released, Hamas does tend to lie, so that won't help all that much either. But it's really horrible that they haven't done that so far. There's really no need for it except for to torture the families of the hostages. Israel is going to withdraw from the major cities and other central areas in Gaza. It's not going to withdraw completely from Gaza until the end of phase two. That's sort of the dynamic there. Hamas is going to maintain most of the hostages, and the IDF will maintain most of its presence in Gaza, and that is supposed to guarantee that phase two will occur. More humanitarian aid is going to enter Gaza. Over 600 trucks are going to enter Gaza, hopefully alleviating whatever shortages there are in the Gaza Strip. And the people who live in northern Gaza will be allowed to return home. That's over 1 million people. And there will be very little security as they travel on their way up. From what I understand, people on foot are going to be going through no checks whatsoever, and people in cars will be going through fairly minimal checks. Now, there was an entire drama around the Philadelphia corridor in the summer, and there was an entire manufactured drama around the Philadelphia corridor this morning. This morning, when I woke up, it looked like there might not be a deal because there was all these claims and counterclaims. Israel said that Hamas was causing last-minute difficulties about the Philadelphia corridor, and Hamas was saying that Israel wasn't providing maps, and the whole thing looked like it might collapse. over that. It looks like there was no real drama over the Philadelphia corridor. It was manufactured by Netanyahu's people in order to make it appear like there's a last minute crisis and Netanyahu stood firm to give it a little bit less of a sense that Netanyahu was caving. That had a very limited influence, I believe, on public opinion. It looks like the Philadelphia corridor will be completely evacuated, um, and so will the Rafah crossing, which will be operated by some sort of combination of the Egyptians and non-Hamas Palestinians, PA, probably, maybe without using the name PA, because that's, something you're not supposed to do in internal Israeli politics. Now, so, as I already mentioned, on day 16, that's when the negotiations on phase two will commence. There are guarantees that phase two will happen. Meanwhile, Netanyahu has promised Smotrich that phase two will not happen. What I'm hearing from my sources is that it's very unlikely that there won't be a phase two. The main reason being that Trump really wants the war in Gaza to end. Trump wants to turn his attention towards domestic affairs, um, in particular, deporting illegal immigrants, possibly annexing all sorts of things, gutting various departments in the US government. He's busy and he doesn't want the war to distract. And if Israel tries to renew the war between phase one and phase two, it will likely pay a very significant cost. It will also pay that cost in terms of relations with Egypt and Qatar, who are guaranteeing the agreement. Trump is looking at the hostage deal as something to move towards also the expansion of the Abraham Accords and towards Saudi normalization. It's important to him to have a signature diplomatic achievement and also one that Biden notably failed to achieve. So he'll be looking to do that. That means that Trump will likely be pressuring Israel towards making some sort of nod towards the recognition of a Palestinian state. So he'll be pressuring Israel to do that. And the last thing he's going to need, if he's trying to get normalization with Saudi Arabia, is for Israel to renew the war. And so I think it's quite unrealistic for Israel to renew the war. I also am not sure how much support Netanyahu would have if he looked for some reason to renew the war. The war is now quite unpopular in Israel, and the deal is quite popular. Nevertheless, Netanyahu is facing a ton of pressure from a lot of his closest allies, people in his own party, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir. It's been notable that Ben-Gvir has been quite quiet by his standards. I mean, he's tweeted, he's talked, he said all sorts of things. But Ben-Gvir is usually much more vocal in his opposition. But that doesn't mean that he's not opposing the deal. In fact, it looks like he's more serious about leaving the government this time than before. He said that he thinks that Smotrich and him should leave together. It's not clear what he does if Smotrich doesn't leave. The estimates from the Likud right now are that Ben-Gvir will leave, whether Smotrich does or not. Politically, that makes sense for him. That way, he can divorce himself from this deal, which will be, whether it's successful or not, the deal will be very unpopular with his voters. So it makes sense from his perspective. Smotrich is trying to place himself as extreme right wing, but more responsible, and therefore differentiate himself from Ben Gvir. And that's why he might remain. But Smotrich has said, he tweeted today, that Netanyahu promised him that the war will renew, and if the war doesn't renew, he's going to be leaving the government. Either way, even if he leaves, he likely will vote with the government. He said he has no desire to bring down the government. So that leaves Netanyahu with some options. He has 42 days now until the second phase starts. He likely will be forced into the second phase by Trump. But until then, he can try to bring in more achievements to try to keep Smotrich in the government, maybe get Ben-Gvir to come back, something like that. Those things might include steps towards Saudi normalization, which might help with the public but wouldn't help with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And what would help with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir is annexation of the settlements and a possible attack on Iran, especially one with the United States. An attack on Iran is very useful because not only is it a great achievement for Netanyahu, but also it creates a state of emergency, which gives Smotrich an excuse to stay in the government. So you might see that happen if Trump agrees to it. That would be a great victory for Netanyahu. Um, and would also achieve something that Netanyahu has been talking about for 20 years, the destruction of the Iranian nuclear deal, which would also contribute to his long term legacy as Israeli prime minister. Finally, let's talk about the whole day after thing. I've been talking here about why there needs to be a day after. From the beginning of the war, a lot of people have been against it, and now we are at the day after, and there is no plan. What's going to happen is that if there is a phase two, there's going to be negotiations during phase two over what happens in phase three. And phase three will be the day after. And that will have to be negotiated with the agreement of Hamas, which means that Hamas will remain in power in one way or another. So that's what happens when there's no day after plan. Others decide what will happen in the future. A terrible defeat for Israel, and one that could have been prevented if Israel had decided what kind of future it wants for Gaza and had gone boldly towards implementing it. Okay, so I have a couple of questions from you. The last episode was quite popular. Crystal Concentrics asked, "You said annex the West Bank in passing in the last episode, with zero precedence, at least in this broadcast. I've been hearing about that. Can you explain what's going on with that conversation?" Yeah, so very little has been going on with that conversation, in the sense that there's not much going on publicly, but um, representatives of the West Bank municipalities have been in close contact with the Trump administration. Some of them have been invited even to the inauguration, and they are working diligently to get him to annex the settlements. There are people in the administration who are for that, and there are people in the administration who are against that. Netanyahu has never particularly wanted that, but if it can help him keep Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in the coalition, he might do that. Now, what does it mean to annex? The annexation will likely, almost definitely, not include the big Palestinian cities. So don't expect an annexation of Ramallah, Nablus, etc. Instead, there'll be an annexation of the big settlement blocks, which Trump might recognize, like he did in the Golan Heights. He's shown that he's willing to do these sorts of things. It would be really symbolic. It sounds like a big deal, but it's not, because Israel has annexed the settlements. Israel has put its law uh, in the settlements. It rules the settlements as the same way it rules the rest of Israel. It doesn't actually differentiate. Legally, technically, it's not part of Israel in terms of international law, but in terms of the way Israeli law works, it already is. It would make very little difference. And annexation is reversible in the sense that if there's a peace deal, Israel can always give back areas that it has already annexed. So it doesn't really have much meaning. But of course, it doesn't contribute to peace or anything like that. It certainly won't help move towards a Palestinian state. So Trump will be torn over that because people will tell him this might be a problem in getting Saudi normalization or something like that. But if Trump can do that and get Saudi normalization, I think he would. Um, I have a question from Ian, longtime friend of the show. Is annexing the West Bank settlements only reflecting facts on the ground? I suspect that Trump will be okay with that, but not taking out the Iranian nuclear program. If that's the case, will Bibi still be able to claim a win? So yeah, so as I said, it is just facts on the ground, unless it also includes annexing other areas uh, or big cities, which seems unlikely to me. As for the Iranian program, I'm not so sure that Trump wouldn't agree to an attack on the Iranian program. It wouldn't harm Saudi normalization. It would keep Netanyahu on side. It could be a good compensation for keeping the ceasefire going. So I can actually see that happening. It's also a campaign promise that Trump has made that he will act against the Iranian nuclear weapons. So I'm not saying you're wrong, but I could totally see Trump doing that. Okay, so that's it for this episode, this very happy episode. I hope that over the coming episodes, I will be able to cover the realization of this dream of having the hostages finally come home, having the bloodshed end. So I will be seeing you again here very soon. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Consider listening to my History of the Land of Israel podcast. Thank you to everyone who has been so supportive, and I'll see you here soon.